Chapter 28. Vivian. Vivian excused herself with the kind of soft smile that made noblewomen lean closer and servants step aside without question. She stood with grace, made some polite mention of needing the lavatory, and left the Joe family dining room without looking back. Her slippers whispered against the polished stone as she turned the first corner. By the time she passed the hanging lanterns and stepped into the silent corridor outside the east wing, the air shifted, and so did her face. Gone was the practiced composure, the faint smile, the imperial stillness. She leaned against a wooden pillar just past the carved window and exhaled, quiet but sharp. What the hell was that? She pressed a hand to her chest, not because she was in pain, but because she could still feel the aftershocks of the night. Since when did I kneel? Since when did I scrape? Since when did I act like that in front of a man I barely know? A man I don't even like? The Lee heiress did not perform. The Lee heiress expected performance. And yet tonight, she had bowed so deeply her braid brushed the floor. She had handed out gifts like blessings from the heavens. She had smiled at children, thanked servants, let Margaret Jo feed her like a beloved daughter. None of that had been the plan. She had intended to arrive late, just late enough to make a point, just long enough to remind them who she was. But then the path icon footage had resurfaced in her mind. Her father, Ethan, that moment in the grand hall when he'd stood between Zhenhua and Jinshun and declared that the honor of House Lee was his to protect. That she was his to protect. That hadn't been performance. It hadn't been strategy. It had been restraint, grace, power worn with humility. And something inside her had clicked. If he could do that for her, then she could show him the same. But if she was going to do it, she would do it flawlessly. No half measures, no clipped gestures or symbolic bows. She would show respect as if it were a sword drawn not for battle, but for peace. And yet, she dragged a hand down her face. Why did I get snippy when he was talking to the Wang daughter? The question landed like a slap. She had told herself it was about propriety, about appearances, that a husband in front of family should know better than to make his bride invisible. But that voice, too quiet, too honest, rose from the back of her mind like a ghost. If it was just about respect, why did it feel like betrayal? She had said it lightly, of course. It's rare for a husband to ignore his wife at dinner. Just polite enough. Just edged enough to land. But she'd meant it. And she'd meant it personally. He shouldn't have been talking to Claire, she thought again. I'm his wife. He should be paying attention to me. She froze. That thought, raw and reflexive, echoed like thunder in the corridor. What the fuck? She straightened from the pillar, staring at nothing. There it was again. Unbidden. Unsettling. I'm his wife. Politically. Socially. Emotionally. Possessively. The very thing she'd designed the marriage to avoid. Her jaw tightened. She turned abruptly, walking down the corridor with quick, silent steps. Not back to the dining room. Not yet. She needed a moment to collect herself. Or maybe to run from a thought that refused to be buried. Vivian returned to the dining hall composed. No, more than composed, flawless. Every line of her robe refolded. Her expression perfectly blank. The softness that had slipped in earlier was packed away again, sealed behind silk and instinct. She stepped through the threshold like she hadn't just questioned her own sanity. Ethan glanced up as she entered. Their eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't nod, but his posture shifted ever so slightly, as if he'd been watching for her. She moved back to her seat beside Margaret with a faint incline of her head. The table had returned to idle chatter in her absence. Claire's voice was the loudest, making some dry remark about market trends and southern tariffs. No one responded. Vivian allowed herself a breath. Then, a ripple. Not magical. Social. The outer hall murmured with the soft rustle of arrival. Attendants announcing a carriage, doors opening, voices too practiced to be accidental. A servant leaned in and whispered to Margaret, who brightened immediately. Oh, wonderful timing. I was hoping they'd stop by. Vivian didn't ask who they were. She didn't have to wait long. The doors parted like the opening of a stage curtain, and in glided Marissa Lynn, short, glossy-haired, dressed in soft coral robes cinched tightly around a frankly outrageous figure. 18 years old, already the subject of 4 fan-painted path icon scrolls. Breasts far too generous for her frame, hips that swayed with weaponized innocence, and eyes that sparkled like she didn't know she was chaos incarnate. But make no mistake, Vivian didn't underestimate her. Marissa Lynn knew exactly what she was doing. She absolutely knew. Vivian's jaw didn't tighten. Her eyes didn't narrow. But something cold and serpentine coiled low in her spine. The Lynn family entered in practiced formation. Marissa at the center, radiant in soft coral silk, flanked by her parents, Lord and Lady Lynn Minor nobles with respectable holdings along the southern border. Their wealth came from ancestral trade routes and seasonal jade exports, but their influence came from proximity. Old Joe blood, tied by shared rights and centuries of politically expedient marriages. This visit was not spontaneous. This had intent. Lord Lynn bowed to Margaret and Robert Joe with the appropriate blend of formality and ease. We're grateful to be received on such short notice. My daughter has been eager to offer her respects. Lady Lynn smiled tightly. It's not every day the Joe sons return with their brides. Her eyes flicked first to Claire, then to Vivian. Evaluating, Claire stood and bowed lightly. Lady Lynn, Lord Lynn, a pleasure. Vivian followed suit, just slightly more precise. Claire was warm. Vivian was flawless. Neither smiled. Marissa, of course, curtsied last. A little deeper than necessary. A little slower. The kind of curtsy meant to catch light and draw eyes. I hope we're not intruding, she said sweetly, her voice bright with unearned innocence. Margaret rose with a practiced smile. Not at all, Marissa dear. We're so pleased you could make it. Come sit. You remember Ethan, don't you? Marissa turned her head with an exaggerated kind of grace and beamed. Marissa practically skipped over, the top of her head barely reaching Ethan's shoulder as she slid into the empty seat at his other side. Ethan straightened just slightly. Marissa, he said calmly. You've grown, she tittered. You always say that. Maybe you just haven't caught up, but... Marissa leaned forward in a very exaggerated way. Vivian picked up her teacup. It didn't rattle. Claire glared, her eyes sharpening like knives. Marissa turned her entire body toward Ethan, one leg crossed over the other in a deliberate show of bounce and angle. And suddenly she was laughing at everything he said, even the things he didn't say. Vivian watched it all with the elegance of a queen watching court jesters perform. Detached, above it, unbothered, until Marissa reached out lightly, fingertips brushing Ethan's sleeve. That's when Vivian set her cup down. Softly. So softly it made more noise than if she'd slammed it. The table quieted for half a second. Marissa blinked. Claire blinked harder. Ethan glanced her way, and Vivian, still smiling, tilted her head just enough to catch his eye. He held her gaze for a breath, then turned back to Marissa. Vivian folded her hands in her lap. She wasn't jealous. Of course not. She was just noticing. That was all. After all, she'd already done more than she should have tonight. And if the little peach blossom with breasts bigger than her ambition thought this was her moment, well, she was wrong. And Vivian would make sure she understood that. Chapter 29. Marissa. Marissa Lynn was glowing. Not figuratively, literally. Her mana aura always shimmered when she was excited, and tonight, it sparkled like lantern light on the lake. Their family carriage curved up the eastern drive of the Joe estate, and she leaned forward against the velvet cushion, clutching her mother's sleeve with both hands like a child on a festival night. Sit properly, her father muttered, not looking up from his schedule crystal. I'm visiting Ethan, she whispered back. That doesn't mean you get to bounce. Yes, it does, she said sweetly. Her mother sighed but smiled. Don't touch your face. You're flushed enough. She ignored the warning and checked her reflection in the mirrored charm embedded in her bracelet. Hair, perfect. Robes tighter than last time. Chest, standing strong. Eyes, wide, glowy, and innocent. It was time. The carriage slowed. Outside, lanterns lined the paths. The manor was lit from within like a jewel box. She could feel the projections already watching path icons, scribbling and whispering and broadcasting little bursts of gossip for the public stream. Good. Let them see. The doors opened. Marissa stepped out like she was descending from the clouds. Her parents followed at a polite distance, offering bows and greetings to the Joe household attendants. She barely noticed. All she saw was the light through the windows and the silhouette of him. Tall, poised, quiet, Ethan Joe. Marissa's heartbeat skipped, then stuttered. Gods, he looked good. Not in the overly polished, court boy kind of way-oiled hair and posturing arrogance, but refined. Calm. Like a lake so deep it reflected the stars. No one else had eyes like his. Not that sharp shade of storm sky blue. Not that voice like warm thunder. And not that quiet restraint that made her want to shatter it. She knew how people looked at her. She knew what her walk did to the boys at the academy. She'd seen the likes, the messages, the scrambled flattery sent through charm interfaces every day. But Ethan had never looked at her like that. He looked at her like she wasn't quite real. That would change tonight. She adjusted her robe's delicate coral silk, embroidered so tightly it hugged every curve, and walked through the main hall like she owned it. The receiving chamber doors parted, and there he was, seated at the table, laughing at something. Laughing. She almost stopped walking. He was even more beautiful than she remembered. And beside him, Vivian Leigh, cold, composed, drenched in elegance, looking like a statue someone prayed to and then regretted it. Marissa felt something twist. Vivian Leigh had once been her idol, one of the four great beauties, the Crane of House Leigh, untouchable, but she had taken him, no worse. She had married him, and barely even looked at him like he mattered. Marissa watched her for half a second too long, then dropped her gaze, put on her brightest smile, and floated forward with a bow so perfect it hurt to execute. "I hope we're not intruding," she said. Margaret Jo smiled and welcomed her in. A seat was offered beside Ethan. She didn't hesitate. And when she turned her head to face him, tilting her shoulder just so, chest forward just enough, she smiled like she hadn't spent the last 2 years dreaming of this moment. "Marissa," he said calmly, "you've grown." His eyes flicked toward her. And for one instant, one breath, he smiled. Marissa's whole body went warm. She didn't care that Vivian was sitting right there. She didn't care that Claire Wang was down the table looking like someone had stepped on her name day gift. She didn't even care that Caleb Joe looked like he wanted to throw something. Let them. Marissa Lynn was done waiting. And tonight, she was going to begin her ascent. Marissa settled into her seat like the queen she was. She didn't care that Ethan was married. She didn't care that Vivian was one of the four beauties. She was a queen way more than Vivian ever would be. She belonged at that table. She would make sure they all understood that. Her family had been close to the Joe estate for generations, distant cousins, through some marriage line no one bothered to remember. She'd visited this estate since she was old enough to chase koi through the side pond. She knew the walls, the layout, the rhythm of the servants, even which tea sets Margaret Jo liked best. This wasn't intrusion. It was return. She leaned just a little toward Ethan. Not touching, not too obvious, just close enough that if he turned his head, their shoulders might brush. "You've really changed," she said in a low voice, soft enough that no one else could catch it. "I mean it. You used to walk around with ink stains on your hands and forget to comb your hair." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That was a long time ago." "It wasn't that long ago. Besides, I remember everything," she said. "Especially where you are concerned." He gave the smallest of nods and turned back toward the table. Marissa followed with a sip of tea and a smile. She could feel the eyes. Claire's, Caleb's, and yes, most deliciously Vivian's. The silence was always the loudest part. Marissa smiled faintly, swirling her tea. "My father says the capital's gone mad over those reform decrees. Everyone wants bloodline stabilization clauses added into the marriage codes. Probably because half the empire is trying to marry into rare inheritance lines," Ethan replied evenly. "Some families are claiming their bloodlines shifted immediately after sealing. The Lings reported an evolution last season. They say it's tied to the new sealing rite." She tilted her head, lips curving. "I heard. Miranda Ling supposedly developed a flame affinity that's almost identical to Darren's flame embodiment. Imperial monitors are calling it a breakthrough. Instant compatibility. Instant potential. It's practically bloodline alchemy." "More like selective cultivation," Ethan said. "But yes, a preview." Marissa's eyes sparkled. "Some of those bloodlines are very tempting." His gaze flicked toward her again. She felt it land. Success. But then, Vivian Leigh set down her teacup. The sound was soft. Too soft. Like a threat wearing perfume. For the first time, Marissa dared a glance across the table. Vivian met her eyes. No smile, no coldness. Just stillness. Like an archer notched but not drawn. Marissa's stomach flipped. That wasn't supposed to happen. Vivian was supposed to be bored. Detached. Above all this. Instead, she looked like she was measuring her. Marissa tilted her chin and smiled sweetly. "Lady Leigh, you're even more beautiful in person. I almost didn't recognize you without your veil." Vivian blinked once. Marissa felt the temperature drop 2 degrees. Then, gracefully, with a diplomat's poise, Vivian inclined her head. "The path icons always edit their projections," she said. "Reality tends to be sharper." Marissa kept smiling. Barely. The conversation at the table resumed, but suddenly it felt like walking through a garden filled with traps. The smiles, the laughter, the politeness all there. But so were the eyes. Ethan was watching both of them now, a bit of bewilderment on his face. Claire looked like she wanted to vanish. And Vivian? Vivian took another bite of lotus root with the indifference of a woman who could have the table flipped and still come out looking clean. Marissa straightened. Fine. So Vivian had decided to play. So had she. This wasn't over. This was the opening move. Chapter 30, Claire. Claire sipped her tea with perfect grace. She kept her spine straight, her eyes attentive, her mouth poised in a smile that had won over ministers and mothers alike. But inside, she was unraveling. Across the table, Caleb sat in moody silence. Not unusual. He wore sulking like a second skin. But tonight, he wasn't sulking at her. He wasn't glaring at Ethan either. He was watching Vivian. Furtive glances. Quick and guilty. Not desire, not exactly something meaner. Like envy, bottled and sweetened for court. Claire hated it. Vivian had walked in and owned the room. Of course she had. That robe alone probably cost more than the Joe Estate's annual tribute. Every movement was measured, every word shaped like a blade in velvet. But she was Caleb's sister-in-law. Why was he looking at her like that? Then again, she thought bitterly, Caleb never had much discipline when it came to what wasn't his. Still, what scraped her raw tonight wasn't Caleb's wandering attention. It was Ethan's. She'd been talking to him. Really talking for the first time in what felt like lifetimes. She brought up something that actually mattered to her. Merchant guild reforms, tiered licensing, enforcement clauses. Dry to some, not to him. Or at least, not to the Ethan she used to know. And for a moment, just a breath of one, he was there again. The way he used to be. Bright, sharp-eyed, quietly intense. The kind of man who listened so fully it made you feel smarter just for speaking. She'd leaned in. Not physically, emotionally. Then Vivian spoke. Just one line, light as air. Ethan turned. Claire felt the temperature in her chest drop. Then, like fate twisting the knife, in came Marissa Lynn. And the rest of the table seemed to forget Claire existed. Marissa was exactly the kind of girl who made headlines in Path Icon reels. Just 18, built like a goddess drawn by a drunk artist. Exaggerated in all the right places and barely aware of how dangerous she looked. Or maybe too aware. She bounced. She laughed. She brushed Ethan's sleeve like she owned his affection. And Ethan, he didn't pull away. He didn't lean in either. Typical Ethan. Measured. Polite. But then again, his eyes did flicker to her chest. Claire felt something sting beneath her ribs. She forced a smile. She had no right to be upset. No right to feel anything at all. But lately the dreams had been getting worse. She didn't know if worse was the right word. But they were stronger. Deeper. Always the same feeling like being wrapped in warmth just beyond the firelight. A presence. Tall. Quiet. Steady. Watching her. Protecting her. Sometimes there were fragments. A pale blue glow. The feel of hands catching her as she fell. A voice low, calm, and familiar in a way that didn't make sense. She never saw his face, but she knew it was him. Every time she woke from those dreams, her pulse was racing, her throat tight, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a truth she didn't want to name. It wasn't Caleb. It never had been. It was Ethan. Don't be ridiculous, she told herself. Dreams mean nothing, but dreams didn't make your breath catch at the sound of a voice. Dreams didn't twist your stomach when someone else laughed at his joke. Dreams didn't make you jealous. She clenched her jaw, stared at the tea in her cup, and forced herself to breathe. He's not your boyfriend, she reminded herself brutally. He's your husband's brother. And no matter what dream said, no matter what memory whispered, that made all the difference. Claire smoothed her robe and placed her teacup on the saucer with delicate finality. She had to leave. Not dramatically, not hastily, just quietly, gracefully, the way women like her did when they'd overstayed dignity's welcome. Everything about the evening had shifted. Vivian was glowing beneath the polished mask of nobility, basking in the attention of Ethan's mother like she'd always belonged. Marissa had turned the dining table into her personal stage, all bouncing charm and flattering gasps. And Ethan, he sat there, still and steady, as if none of it surprised him, as if none of it bothered him. as if she weren't even there. Claire angled slightly toward Margaret Jo, preparing to offer a polite smile and some excuse about needing to check on a servant or send a message home. But Caleb spoke first, loud enough to make everyone pause. "Marissa," he said, his voice low and smooth. "It's been a long time since I visited your family estate. Perhaps I could stop by during next season's Bloom Week? I remember you always hosted an excellent evening procession." Claire froze. Not because he'd spoken, but because of how he said it. Too confident. Too familiar. The kind of voice that wanted everyone at the table to hear. Marissa blinked, smiled, and completely changed temperature. "Oh," she said sweetly, "I don't think that's necessary. Our guest list has been a bit selective lately." The room went quiet. Then Vivian, without looking up from her chopsticks, murmured, "Ah, the value of discernment." Claire couldn't decide if she wanted to laugh or scream. Caleb looked like he'd swallowed a live coal. But Marissa, never missing a beat, turned back toward her Ethan, and batted her lashes with a force that should have been classified as an arcane technique. "Actually," she said brightly, "Ethan, you studied at the academy longer than anyone expected, didn't you? I heard your research into legacy-bound constructs was so advanced the elders tried to seal your notes." Claire's heart skipped. She remembered that. She'd read those notes, helped him organize them. Ethan didn't even blink. That was a long time ago. "But still," Marissa pressed, "you were always so brilliant with energy harmonics. Would you consider visiting the academy sometime? Maybe giving a short lecture to the advanced class? Even just a demonstration." Claire waited for him to deflect, to change the subject, to show some humility, to look at her. Instead, Ethan nodded once. Calm, polite. "If the headmaster approves, I'd be happy to." Claire felt the breath leave her chest. He wasn't hers, not in any way that mattered. And it didn't matter how many papers they'd written together, how many nights they'd shared tangled in thought and maybe more. It didn't matter if she dreamed of him or remembered the exact weight of his laugh in her hands. He had moved on. And now, apparently, so had she. Claire rose with perfect poise. "I should return to the guest quarters," she said to no one in particular. "It's been a long day." Margaret gave her a warm smile and patted her hand. No one else stopped her. No one asked her to stay. She didn't look back. Not at Ethan. Not at Marissa. And certainly not at Caleb.